Perfect. So maybe just to first kick us off, just here at the DPI map team, kind of running this particular project. Very excited myself. The principal investigator on this. I'm a co-deputy director at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and an associate professor of digital government. I teach here in our Masters of Public Administration program at IIPP, whichever, if you're interested in, please also email me. I'd love to tell you about that. Joining me is Christina Rao, who's really been the project manager of the DPI map and like a driving force in making things happen. Anyone who's been on a call with us knows Christina and knows the amazing work that she's been doing. And so she's not new, but if she's new to you, that means I'm probably new to you as well. And we're really excited you could join us. And we can't talk about this work. And then, but new to almost everybody is Mitchell Pass, who's joined us more recently as a research fellow here at the IIPP, and is really helping us kind of curate and think about this community management work that we're going to be doing around this community of practice. And so, Mitchell, very, very grateful you can join us and excited to have you as part of our team. Let's go to our next slide. So for this call, what I'd like to do is first just start talking about like where we're at right now around DPI measurement, like what is like kind of like the work we've been doing, what we've been observing going on around the place, like what's the progress that's been made so far. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the objectives and scope for this community of practice. Like, why are we creating this? What do we think? What is the thing we think it's serving? Why do we think it's helpful to pull some people together? And then we'll have an open discussion about like what are the kind of measurement concerns that are in your work, just to help us learn how we could shape and form this community of practice and the work that they could be doing. Let's go to the next slide. This work really, in part, is a reflection of our desire to work in the open. So we've been doing this measurement work at the DPI map for like coming on almost 2 years now. And we've been trying to work as much in the open as we possibly can, like blogging about our work, sharing our progress. And then as we were thinking about, we want to actually do more still to kind of refine our methodology, we said, like, wouldn't it be better if we were just doing that like in the open with other people, but inviting them in as well and learning from them and getting kind of more buy-in into this process. And so more people felt ownership about a framework for measuring DPI that was really community-led. And so this is kind of our desire to both work in the open, but see if we can curate a shared understanding about what these frameworks are that people feel collective ownership over. And as we were kind of looking around the community of people who were kind of engaging in measurement, there was some of us who were engaged kind of like in looking at what is the prevalence of DPI. And so I think particularly us and like Africa Nenda, who does amazing work in the space and has been an incredible partner, they are kind of like looking at like what exists. And then there's people at kind of like an other end, which is trying to look at like what is the impact of DPI. And there you have the team at Oxford that's been doing work, especially I believe with Ethiopia, Dalberg, which is doing some work on kind of creating a framework for like how to do measurements of DPI in multiple different countries, and JPAL as well, like very, very kind of impact focused. And then there's a bunch of other players that are also kind of in the space. So like Dial's actually doing things on both sides. They do some stuff on the prevalence, but they also are doing case studies that look at impact. iCrier is looking at things that are coming, like doing an index for within India about what's going on in DPI within there. And of course, many other players that are listed here are providing data to many of us to help inform our thing. So we have all these stakeholders that are in our ecosystem that we thought would be kind of interesting to kind of pull together and have a broader conversation with. Let's go to the next slide. So if we are thinking about kind of like measurement, we're particularly focused on the prevalence side. So how widespread are DPI deployments? And then there's this impact side. But I think these two things are really tightly connected together. So go to the next slide. Like if you are looking at the impact, you have to know what the prevalence is. And you actually have to know, like looking at the map, for example, what are the various kind of elements of DPI that exist in the country that you could then explain are having the impact. So we have all these indicators we're looking at. If you were like looking at impact, you'd want to know, well, what indicators exist? What attributes exist in the country that could help explain the impact it's having or what's missing? And meanwhile, we also are deeply interested in impact because what is impactful are probably things that we should be thinking about measuring when it comes to prevalence. Like the conditions that create impact are the things that we're probably more interested in actually measuring and evaluating. So creating this dialogue between these two strikes me as enormously important. And if we go to the next slide, that's a big part of like what we hope this community of practice could be able to do around measurement, which is both help us with our prevalence work, but really help everybody get smarter and learn how we can all use each other's work to get better and stronger and smarter about what's going on in the DPI space. We go to the next slide. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting about this work is both for impact and prevalence, but we definitely feel this is like there's a whole bunch of layers that are taking place on top of the measurement work that we're doing. So everything from like the G20, where South Africa has announced that measurement's going to be a key focus for their presidency, and they're going to be working. They've been working with us and others on this, but also like the UNDP Safeguard Initiative. We used what they were doing to inform what we should measure. But then when they started to publish and they did their public consultation, we reached out and shared with them, hey, if you are thinking about safeguards, you want to measure whether those safeguards are effective or not. Here's what we've learned about measuring. This should inform how you are designing and thinking about safeguards, which they found useful as well. So people are kind of building up upon our work. And so we want to make sure that whatever is being laid as a foundation on the prevalence side is helping support all the work that's going on top of it. Okay, so the DPI map that we run, that Christina is the project manager for, is really kind of like taking like an assessment of what's happening all around. It's like trying to report on every DPI deployment, and it's constantly iterating. And so just always like to have a note, if you see that there's something you think is missing in the map or something has changed, please send us. We always want to have new data, and we're very grateful to people both on the previous slide, on this slide, who are constantly sending us updates of things they're observing in the community so we can keep our data as up to date as possible. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Perfect. So what we'd like to do is maybe start to ask some questions from all of you to kind of inform the conversation today and the conversation we're hoping to have over the next few months. So if you have a cell phone, you can scan that QR code, or you can enter slido.com and enter that number in, and it will immediately begin to ask you a question, which you could begin to answer. So what we just wanted to first know is, what pulled you into this call? How would you like to use this community?
Feel free to also use a chat box. This is a suggestive list of why we thought you would come to this call. Sometimes we're hoping you just like listening to us talk about our work, but we're also hoping you can contribute. If you have ideas already, feel free to use a chat box to put those down. Okay, nice. The community element of things is already standing out, so that's exciting for us. For those who said you'd like to showcase your work, there's space. We keep calling this a community, and we're yet to explain why we think this is going to be a community, but there's definitely space for you to bring those ideas to the forum. So stay in touch, wait for like 10 minutes, and you'll find out exactly how you can showcase your work. But also, if you already want to flag an initiative, use the chat box, because we have folks in this room who are trying and doing a very diligent job. Hi, Michelle, to track exactly who is attending this, what do they want to talk about, how can we collaborate, things like that. Okay. With that, maybe I'd take over. Thank you, David.
Go for it, Christina. Thank you.
So we've spent some time figuring out exactly where we want to situate this community of practice. But if you're not familiar with the DPI mapping project and some of the work we've already done, then we thought it might be a good moment to just highlight some of the positioning, where we're coming from and why we think this is important. So IIPP has been running the DPI mapping project for about more than a year now, a year and a half. And in October last year, we came out with a global data set on what deployments across the globe look like in terms of their technology features, their governance features, as well as the degree to which they are adopted. Now, each of these words you're going to stay with, and I'm pretty sure you already have thoughts on how to measure each of these aspects around technology governance adoption. We had to come up with a best case scenario of measuring it, and then figure out what is a viable version of what we can measure given the kind of data out there on deployments. We did some scanning. We collected this data for across a year for about 210 countries, and we found some stats, and those stats are here. We found that basically what we're calling DPI looks very different across the world, but one thing we can all agree on is that there are way more deployments out there across identity systems, payment systems, and data exchange systems that have DPI-like features across the world. For identity systems, there are as many as 57. Of course, there's some nuances to how these are studied in terms of they must be active, they must be an all-of-government ID system and not just a sectoral ID system. They must most fundamentally facilitate a certain function around digital authentication to ensure that Christina is really Christina and she is eligible for this certain service. Similarly, for payment systems, we did a similar scan. We found about 93 digital payment systems that exhibit DPI-like features. And for data exchange systems, these are about 103. But these numbers are just numbers until you look at regional features, you look at how they change across the globe. And we found very high variability across governance practices, across how these practices are documented and where we look for evidence of certain governance features, so on and so forth. This is to say that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on measurement and doing a good job of measuring DPI. We've scratched the surface, we've unearthed a lot, but the proportion of things that are known unknowns now are bigger than before we started this project. And this is exactly why we want to open the forum to include more people, to let you know how far we got, to see if you could help us get further, if we can collaborate on making some of these measurement ideas happen. This is the space. So a quick, if you've already seen these funnel charts, then that's very exciting for us because it's our simplified way of saying that the way you count DPI matters. Our version is not the best version. Just because we call something a DPI doesn't mean you have to call something a DPI. But we did try to arrive at a few features and indicators that have the most consensus to figure out what might be called a DPI and what is not. To take the example of identity systems, we scanned about 210 countries. We found that about 164 of them had claimed to have a digital or electronic ID, meaning that whatever digital ID system they had, they called it a DPI, a digital ID system that facilitates DPI-like processes and services for the individuals involved. Further to that, we found that only 93 of them were active and in rollout stage. Some of them could have been planned, piloted, but were not necessarily implemented as well on ground. If you filter even further, only about 87 of them had an authentication mechanism, which is to say that you can call something a digital identity system, but that doesn't mean you can take for granted that it facilitates digital authentication, which is that through a digital means, I can figure out if Christina is Christina, Mitchell is Mitchell, and David is David. And of course, to make sure that this is an all-of-government approach and it's an ID system that any department can use, we filtered for whether or not an ID system facilitated authentication, digital authentication in more than one sectoral use case. If it did, then it would be considered an all-of-government digital public infrastructure. And that's how we arrived at the numbers you saw on the previous slide. We did a similar exercise for payment systems and data exchange systems also. The slides will be made available to you, and this is already on a recording of the DPI map launch, so I'm going to skip over some of the others. But what I do want to draw some attention to is all of this work on scanning, measuring, counting was only made possible because we spent at least 4 or 5 months doing consultations with practitioners, with experts, with researchers who had already tried and scratched the surface of what is DPI, what does it look like on ground, how can an ID system exhibit features of DPI, so on and so forth. We've published insights from these consultations in the form of a working paper, which was published earlier this year. The link is going to be provided to you at some point, but it's also the citation is at the bottom, so you can quickly Google search this. But what it told us is that whatever people call DPI have some common features. And this is what we call attributes. And attributes can speak to the technology, it can speak to the governance, it can also speak to the adoption value of digital public infrastructure. There are certain things that we know to be essential to what we call DPI as a concept. And these are, with respect to the technology, we speak to interoperability and extensibility. With respect to the governance, we need DPI to be transparent, accountable, have some degree of public interest oversight. We also need it to value privacy, safety, security, and look into inclusion and non-discrimination. And these are pretty much tenets of what gets counted as a DPI and what doesn't, as opposed to sometimes being regarded as an option to consider something as DPI. This is obviously supported by adoption features. So it matters that DPI is grounded not only in one department of the public sector of the government, but across many of them, and that it is situated in a specific sort of institutional governance framework within the government, so that there are people who can run it, there are skill sets dedicated to making sure that DPI is as interoperable as possible and speaks to as many public value use cases as possible. And of course, public sector budgets get dedicated to it. So once we came up with this concept on the left of what DPI should look like, we tried and scanned if we can compare real-world deployments of ID systems, payment systems, data exchanges with this concept of DPI. We came out with a set of 68 indicators, which are essentially effective norms, rules, technologies, processes, by which you can measure the presence or absence of these attributes. We figured that some of these indicators are more measurable than the others, and some of them may be more of essence to the concept of DPI than others. All of this has been published in our code book on how we weighted them, how we valued them, exactly how we measured each of these indicators, because ultimately they had to be a set of proxies on which data could be collected based on publicly hosted data sets. So each of the government had to be reporting on the data of these indicators for their respective countries, or we had to rely on multilateral partners, international organizations who were reporting on these data points across a region, across the globe, whatever was the scope of their work. And basis all of that, we were able to compile the DPI map dataset, which you now see hosted on our website. Notes on this methodology are also available on the website, but the reason we're spending some time discussing this today is this is the inception of the community of practice. We sort of learned that we've spent a lot of time figuring out what should be measured and how it could be measured, but we're still very far away from creating a very reliable and valid picture of DPI across the globe that can also make space for how heterogeneously it should be studied across regions, across context, and things like that. So this will stay with us, and this will keep coming back. We'll keep coming back to this in our discussions in this community of practice. But hopefully you're to some degree familiar with this framework, and you can help us make it better in the sessions that follow. I have already spoken to this, so I'm going to skip over this and now pass over to Mitchell.
Thank you, Christina. So kind of following on from Christina's review of IIPP's research project over the past 18 months or so, I want to outline a few questions which we've been internally referring to as thematic questions around the measurement of DPI. Along with some suggestive questions. I want to emphasize also that these questions or these problems and the questions alongside them aren't intended as prescriptive instances of like, how the COP will be thinking, but more as indicative examples of the sort of concrete questions we've been coming across. So the first one of those is methodological constraints. And I think as Christina's already outlined, we've encountered a couple of these around data availability, collection methods, and sampling bias. And the thematic question associated with that, which we've been thinking about internally, is greater reliability across geographies, higher validity for a number of users. Moving on from that as well, we've been thinking about inclusion. 1 second. Yeah, we've been finding that inclusion is a somewhat mercurial thing to define. The way we've been doing it so far is largely through the use of proxy metrics. The problem that we've been finding with the use of proxy metrics is that they have a tendency to limit, or they have a tendency to foreclose what we mean by inclusion. Yeah, and they have a tendency to overlook contextual factors. The thematic question we've identified alongside that is what methodologies might capture both technical availability and meaningful accessibility of DPI systems. So what we're thinking about here is this tension between the availability or prevalence of a DPI implementation, and perhaps the gap between that prevalence and how the extent to which it's being used. Moving on from that, the third kind of thematic challenge which we've encountered regards state capacity, and this regards the tendency for current research to be focused on the individual verticals associated with DPI measurement, which exist in kind of opposition to what we understand as the defining feature of DPI implementations, which is their horizontality, the ability to produce a kind of a cross-cutting ecosystem, which is extensible across those verticals. The thematic question we've been identified in relation to that are what are the horizontal enablers of digital public infrastructure or interoperable digital systems in the public sector? Moving on from that, yeah, so kind of within this context of these challenges around measurement, we are launching today as Christina has said, the community of practice around DPI measurement as a way to think together about these questions. The way we're understanding the COP is as building on top of the empirical research that Christina has talked about, and attempting to broaden it through community discussions. Ideally, we want to bring together practitioners and researchers, DPI experts, to improve how we think about measuring DPI. If we move on from that, Christina. We have now another Slido poll. The question being, what aspects of DPI have you found challenging to measure? So yeah, I suppose I've run through that quite quickly. So if we give the audience a moment to kind of take stock.
Yeah, we kind of offered ourselves and our work as sacrifice, but hopefully it's jogging your memory on aspects of DPI that you found challenging to measure. And if you can articulate that for us, we can try and see if there's convergence, or yeah, we should just proceed separately and not work together. Okay,
Yeah, exactly.
Inclusion there's some votes for inclusion, so that helps, some validation for it is tough to measure. It is sticky in some ways.
Yeah, usage. So we've had an endless number of debates on the DPI mapping team on like what we should be measuring, and thinking about usage is always an interesting one, in part because we don't know what the policy objectives are that were driving the creation of the infrastructure. So there may be things that from an outside perspective are perceived as low usage, but actually are meeting the policy objective. And so if we were to kind of rate that poorly, that would not be necessarily fair to that country. Is just one example of the types of dilemmas we found around trying to measure things like usage.
We also have some hands raised. Chauki Adrushi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Probably not. But maybe we can, I know Ben's in the room. Ben, if you can help us bring Chauki to the forum, we can spend a few minutes hearing from you in addition to your responses on this Slido, and then go back to the rest of the presentation. Or I can do that. One sec. Okay, Chauki, you have the podium. Hello, can you hear us? We can't hear you. Okay, Jonathan, glad you could join us. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, can you hear me? I think I did that
Yes.
right. Yeah. So this is great. Thank you for pulling us together. I think the prevalence versus impact cycle is a really good place to start from, and very much aligned with how we've been thinking about some of these questions as well. And thank you, David, for shouting out that Dial is working on both sides. I think sometimes we maybe need to be a little more focused on where we're working, but it is, I mean, it is something we do look at in across the board. I think, not to add complexity to this, but my comment in the response to this question here is, in many ways, and I think a lot of the groups we work with are increasingly talking about DPI as an approach. And to me, when you think about it as an approach to digitization, it becomes all the more important to understand the counterfactuals as well. And so I guess I would put to this group and to you all, how do we think about that, in terms of changing outcomes? And I see a few people have put in the answers here, direct impact on people or markets or household level outcome indicators, right? So we very much have been thinking about things like inclusion, transparency as part of the implementation process and a sustained part of that approach to DPI. And so I think, your attributes are great. It's helpful to think about, but I guess I'm not asking this articulately, but would be curious to get other folks' reactions to this idea of, if you think about DPI as a static thing that can be identified and then measure the impact/outcomes of that static thing, or whether it is this more complex kind of process-oriented measurements throughout. And then, again, if it's the latter, then I think we need to be thinking about what is the alternative approach to digitization, and how does that compare to really have DPI measurement be a meaningful exercise.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really good to hear from you and glad you could join us. I think we've heard similar sort of differences in how people approach measurement. One is they look for some sort of commitment or investment in a DPI approach. And that could mean coming up with a policy document, but not necessarily implementing a system that makes things interoperable in a very specific way for a specific use case. So the question you ask is very relevant. And obviously, I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but it's definitely going to, hopefully we can dedicate some time to this very specific question at one of the sessions.
Yeah, no, and I just offer it not to get answers
Yeah.
today, but to help, this collective group think about that framing and what it means for how to go about thinking about impact.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, the focus that you mentioned on outcome indicators, which is something we had to course correct. We were looking for something static. We were looking for evidence in the form of a technical artifact, a product of sorts. But we had to realize that in order to make space for the different ways in which countries might approach DPI, and they might not start from stage 1, they might start from stage 3 and then build upwards and downwards. We had to make space for a general leaning towards DPI and what it means for technology, for governance, for adoption. And that could only be captured in outcome indicators. But I'm staying with this. I'm not saying it's the way. I wonder how could we do that and also look for something that's more material and static so as to have more consensus on this looks like DPI versus that looks like proto DPI, which is also something that we've been discussing in the work, saying just because something doesn't check the list of your 20 indicators doesn't mean it's not DPI. It might be getting there and it's at an early stage of getting there. So how do we capture something specific, but also make space for heterogeneity is definitely a question worth discussing. Okay, I see no more hands, and we've already had a lot of submissions in the chat box and the Slido. Thanks so much. A few key themes that stand out are DPI, impact measurement, obviously, inclusion. Very good to see that there's some more folks in the room who are struggling with this. And cost. Cost was not the top of our priority list, but it now is. And we'd love to hear if you want to capture in the Slido or you want to capture in the chat box exactly how. I saw some discussion on OPEX and CAPEX, and I think David's responded to it. But just for the sake of keeping with time, we'll move on. And there's more space for an open Q&A right after this. So, Mitchell, back to you.
Yeah, so I'll go back and just outline the scope and objectives of the COP as we describe it. Again, kind of reiterating what Christina and David have already articulated. One of the ways we're thinking about the COP is in terms of a research stack. Again, kind of riffing on what David was saying earlier about the distinction between prevalence and impact research around measurement of DPI. And we kind of understand the work that the COP can do, the community that it can begin to coordinate together, is one which facilitates existing and developing research at the level of measuring DPI prevalence, and then coordinating that and interfacing that with the kind of subsequent layer of research associated with measuring the impacts of DPI. In thinking about this stack metaphor and attempting to operationalize it, a working intuition or assumption that the COP is guided by presently is that there is probably a lot of implicit knowledge locked into project silos. And the goal of the COP is an attempt to horizontally connect or bridge those research verticals and try and integrate those conversations into a more kind of coextensive ecosystem, which is illustrated in the kind of graphic on the right side of the slide. If you could move to the next slide, please, Christina. So this kind of concretely outlines how we see the sessions. So yeah, as we currently imagine the agenda, will comprise of monthly virtual meetings. which we will convene. Which we will convene. The session structure. So I think that the session immediately following on from this one, which will be on April the 8th, I believe, will be on inclusivity. And beyond that, the topics are kind of open to community input. We welcome co-presenters as well. In terms of where you can find us and where the project will be most concretely housed, it will be housed in the DPI Maps central page, and within that page there will be a subsection for the community of practice itself. In terms of concrete outputs, we are mainly directed towards producing a community-led research agenda. So in that regard, we see the COP as a holding space for conversations rather than as a lectern from which we can present our own agenda. Coordinating these spaces and conversations is important. And alongside that, producing an open repository of measurement tools and resources. I know internally, colleagues working alongside Christina are working to produce a cleaned version of the DPI Maps dataset, which I think will be made publicly available at some point in the near future. That's outlined the concrete aspects of the COP. Next slide, Christina. We know what that is. Okay, yeah, so I suppose now it's a call to action, I suppose. As I've just said, that we envision the COP as a holding space for these sorts of conversations, and don't want to direct them too much, so that this QR code links to a form where you can directly engage with us and present ideas for future research topics. If this is unavailable, then getting in touch with either Christine or I directly, and we'll facilitate that for you. As I previously said, the next session on April 8th will be on measuring inclusion in DPI. And beyond that, we're keeping the agenda open and want to remain dynamic to kind of fill in how the community responds in response to this first session. And I think after this, we've laid out our agenda and we move on to a Q&A. I think that was...
Yeah. And just to supplement what Mitchell said, we have set up the topic of inclusion of DPI for the next session, which is, we have a tentative date in mind. We can send you more details and information via email. But if there's anyone in this room who already wants to co-present, co-curate that session, ask very specific research questions that are relevant to your work, the space is open and we can design it around both of our needs and not just the DPI Maps needs. And we'd really, really love to hear from you. If you're working on inclusion, if you have a research question on inclusion, both work, feel free to use the QR code that takes you to the form. If you fill out the form, it's a streamlined process for us. We know exactly who got in touch with us for what topic. But if you prefer it, you can also write to one or all of us. Our email IDs are here. And we'd be pleased to hear from you. We'd probably set up a short call to discuss how we can co-present and co-curate the next session or sessions after that. But hopefully the next session doesn't involve just us speaking. And with that, I think I'm gonna pause. David, if you have notes, I know you've been very active in the chat. So if you want to reflect on that, but the space is also open for you to raise your hands, and we can give you the rights to unmute and speak to us directly.
Yeah, I'll just wait for some hands to come up in case people have questions for us, which I can see Anir already does. But I think
Yes.
like one thing I just want to just really, the chat for me, the questions coming up in the chat for me are a great validation that creating a space like this to talk about methodologies for measurement and what we should be focused on are important, because people are raising, I think, questions we've been asking, questions you hear other people have asking, clearly questions you have. And so this is just as a first reaction, this is enormously validating that we need to create a space to do this, and we want to be influenced by the questions people are asking in the data we're trying to create for the DPI map, in part so we can serve other people in the community more effectively. The main challenge always is, I think one thing just to plant a seed right now is what is realistic to measure and what is the cost of collecting data to measure. So there's like, what should we measure? There's like, are there methodologies by which one could even measure the thing that we want to measure? And then what is the cost? And we at the map are we're always in that triangle trying to figure out how to balance those things. There's things that we'd like to measure that are simply too expensive, like we can't deploy someone to go find in every country around the world. There's some things that we like to measure that we can't even wrap our head around how we would measure it. And so we're always trying to deal with that. And so I just want to let everybody know that conversation will be live for us in each one of these sessions in thinking about how to do that. Maybe Anir. Anir, we cannot hear you. I don't know if you're saying something just yet. If not, if you want to type it into the chat.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, now we hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know, it just sort of disappeared and then reappeared again. Dave, just want to congratulate you. I mean, this was a fantastic presentation. And Christina also. I think the work on DPI map is just such a seminal piece for digital transformation of public institutions and public service delivery. So really, really my heartiest congratulations for this. A very timely discussion, and the great point, Dave, just you mentioned in terms of what is practical and what is not practical. I think from a point of view of comprehensiveness, we want to understand everything about DPI. But I have two questions. I put them in the chat, but also just raise them here. One is that a lot of governments, and this is again from my almost 2 decades of experience in public service transformation from non-digital to digital, taking a whole of government approach. A lot of governments are asking now, so what does DPI give me in addition to the digital transformation aspiration that I have? So I have the aspiration, I want to do this. So how does DPI help me better versus a non-DPI? Because DPI starts with that conversation that you have to have a sort of a comprehensive digital ID, preferably biometrically verified. You have to have interoperable payment systems, and you have to have data exchange, which is standards based. And there is the open data versus non-open data. Those are debates that we can open source versus non-open source proprietary. Those are also debates. That we'll put that aside. But essentially, so what does DPI? Because DPI assumes certain preconditions, which may be expensive or insurmountable by certain governments, right? I mean, they can't take a whole of government. IDs fragmented, payments fragmented, but still digital transformation is possible. So is DPI first getting over the hump and then start measuring, or can we take a DPI as an approach, not as ID, payments, data, but then a whole of government digital transformation approach that we can call DPI, right? So not to be very rigid about those 3 things. So that's one question. I mean, I don't know if I'm making things even more confusing. The second one is that the way you've set it up as prevalence and an impact, I think that's fantastic. So on the prevalence side, I sort of see this as a supply side, and the impact side, I see this as a demand side, if you want to roughly think of it that way. So on the supply side, the 4 big things that I see is the availability of tech, usage of that tech, so usage of in the service integration, because you can have the tech, but services may not be integrated with that DPI tech. Third thing is the political will to drive this whole transformation. And the 4th thing is the organizational capacity to do this, because without organizational capacity, it's just not going to happen. And the Department of Education versus Department of Agriculture may have differing capacity. So those are the 4 things, broad things on the prevalence or supply side. On the demand side, three very important things that I see is whether people are using it, even if services are integrated, are people using these DPI-led or DPI-enabled digital services? Second is, are things safe? Which, since I was part of the safety DPI guidelines, I mean, we talked a lot about safety. And the third is accessibility. Is this accessible for persons with disabilities? Is this accessible for persons who are really poor, extreme poor, who may not have the digital access? Do they have physical access to the digital world? So things like that. Women, small businesses, so they are further marginalized sometimes. So that's the access inclusion angle. So those are the three things. So sorry for this long question, but the DPI versus non-DPI approach, and then these 4 supply side prevalence thing and 3 demand side impact things. So what are practical to measure? Some political will, maybe very difficult to measure.
So
Right?
I think
it's very important ingredient.
Yeah, let me start to let me provide us some initial comments, and Christina and Mitchell may want to come in to add some. So I think the first thing I would say is, for the DPI map, at least, we've focused on data exchange, payments, and identity, just because you have to draw a line somewhere around scope. And I think there is this eternal debate on, like, is DPI an approach, or is it DPI these 3 things? I think actually they're not mutually exclusive, but like, we can't just measure everything. So we've concentrated, and I think would have been particularly helpful, and what we had really, I mean, it's kind of sad to say, we had this great conversation with USAID where they were like, oh, the framework that you have is good, not just for measuring these 3 things, but they really found it actually useful for providing a framework for their staff to evaluate any technology implementation that they might be funding. And so I do actually think that the methodologies here become more broadly applicable, but you have to kind of start somewhere and focus. So I think on the map side, we're focused on those 3 things, but I don't think actually this framework then precludes you from not using it for DPI-like or DPI approach type ways. So I feel like that problem is broadly addressed, but would be open to pushback on that. The second thing I'd say is, when you look at the attributes in the DPI map, at least, they're almost all of them, not all, but like, I want to say like 60 to 70% of them are broadly focused around governance related issues, which are really trying to drive at the question you're raising about, like, inclusion, trust, and safety. Like, it tilts very heavily on that side. It's not kind of like a measurement of, like, what technology you have in place. I think I would just share with everybody on the call, we are deeply interested in people's kind of critiques and feedback about how we could adjust those attributes to better measure the types of, to better measure whether or not there exist systems or processes that are encouraging inclusion and encouraging access. So we're not precious about those at all. We'd love nothing more than to improve them. And I think that's a live part of the conversation about what we want to drive here. Christina, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, I think you're being very, very practical, Dave, because we have to draw the line somewhere, and then data for some indicators are very difficult to actually get. One suggestion, again, just thinking aloud, is that whether we can take certain metrics and bring qualitative indicators. So essentially, sometimes it's yes, no, or how much have you done. But then there are some very vital pieces for digital transformation in general, not just DPI, which is what I see as political will, whether you have the political will to drive things, because DPI requires that mammoth political will, otherwise it's not going to happen across departments. And the second thing is the organizational capacity. So even if we can develop, and these are almost prerequisites, very difficult to measure, but if we could even develop some qualitative aspects for those 2 things, I think it may be really, really useful. So I'm just, again, thinking aloud. I'll maybe think about it more in the next discussion. I can share some ideas. Thank you. This was extremely, extremely useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anir. I do have reactions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass on the mic to Ame and then Leah. I cannot seem to see your hands. Okay, now I do. Ame and Leah, I'm going to give you the permission to talk, but feel free to loop in after Ame.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, I'll keep this brief because I have an email draft already that I'm going to send you offering to do one of like the core sessions in the future. And like I'm speaking from the perspective of having to actually do the work to measure the impact of a DPI, right? Like that's what I did at eGov. So I'm very, very firmly in the camp of DPI for public service delivery, right? I know there are other things we could talk about vis-a-vis ONDC, etc. I'm going to leave those out for now. The reason I'm leaving those out for now is because if you say DPI is for public service delivery, then public service delivery can actually be studied as a chain of events or a supply chain. And then what happens is at each step in that chain, you can say, how is this making a difference? To what Anir was saying earlier, right? Like, how is this making a difference vis-a-vis some other way or some older way of doing it? And I think that you will typically find within a given country context, just given questions of speed and phasing, that you will almost always have like a control or a counterfactual within the country itself, where something is still being done on paper, something is still being done in DPI-like ways, and something is being done in like true gold-plated DPI ways. And so the studying of it in that country context becomes no comments on cost, but like practical or at least like theoretically possible. Yeah, and I think that if we spend a little bit of time on that chain and basically say what's happening to the citizen, okay, what's happening at the employee level, okay, what's happening at the city official or like administrator level, okay, what's happening at like the state policymaker level, okay, all of these guys want to go to certain people to implement the technology for them. What's happening at the implementers level? If you sort of go up that chain, we can come up with multiple versions of impact. Yeah, let me pause that.
Hi. Thanks, Christina and David and Mitchell. Just because we're short on time, I'll try to get to quite quickly. This is a response or perhaps something, urging the group to think through the idea of DPI being an approach versus DPI being infrastructure and seeing them as very separate, particularly if you're looking to evaluate and looking to measure the impact of it. I study DPI in India at the local level, and it's and try to evaluate from a citizen-centric point of view. And if that is the approach one takes, seeing it as an approach means very little in the everyday, right? So to evaluate how people are interacting with it, I need to have a concrete point of contact with DPI, which is usually infrastructure and infrastructural. And so this is just something that I want to put out to the group. And as we move forward to think and think through how we measure and evaluate DPI, the approach aspect can be when we're evaluating it as researchers, and whether it fulfills the criteria of the approach that has been defined. But I think to identify the point of contact infrastructurally is quite critical if we look at it from a citizen-centric point of view and evaluate it from that point of view. Something I'd like to put out to this group as we move forward. Because this approach versus infrastructure, I think, muddies the waters a little bit when we're trying to see really how people are impacted, and this question of inclusion and direct impact on people that we were talking about. I think it throws one off a little bit when trying to really look at that. That's all I wanted to put out for now. Yeah.
Points well received, Vanita and Amia. I think the discerning how we're treating the approach versus the artifact, and just articulating the difference for us will be central to how the rest of the discussion is guided on using these measurement tools and exactly who uses it in what ways. So we're going to keep that central. Before we close, there's one last question. Mansi has joined us, and I know Nidhi and Nick, thanks for coming and participating. Your hands are also raised. I think Mansi is going to speak to what Nidhi has asked in the chat box. So I'm going to let Mansi go, and then we might close but our emails are open and the chat box is open, so please use that. Hi, Mansi.
Hi, sorry, I didn't know rejoining would mean like a restart. I'm sorry, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to highlight on the private sector aspects of DPI. Like, you know, the fact that especially if you're not looking at public services in terms of what ID systems do for benefit transfers or for delivery of welfare services, but if you're looking at the payment systems, or if you're looking at data exchanges where private sector stands to gain, and also in ways that you're trying to integrate small businesses or, you know, opening up or democratizing access for smaller businesses, are we also thinking of measuring, moving beyond impact on individuals and citizen centricity of DPIs to also include businesses? I think that's the short point that I wanted to make about looking at the private sector, looking at small businesses. What is it doing to the markets? That part. I thought we hadn't covered it, but I'm not sure. I may have missed that discussion if it happened.
No, we haven't covered it. And I'm going to throw it back to you and say maybe iCrea has something to say about measuring that aspect. And at some point, Mansi, it would be nice for you to take
Sure.
that.
Yeah, I think that's something that, you know, we're trying to think about because I think while the individual citizen centricity is extremely important, but I think one of the big things, at least more and more access, that like the India's digital identity framework is now being opened up for so many types of authentication services, especially to the private sector. So much more being opened up with UPI for credit, insurance, building of so many private sector services. One would want to imagine what is happening to small businesses and whether the spirit of democratizing business and access is really happening, or is that an objective? I mean, that's one we have to define. Is that an objective? And if it is, how far have we gotten with it, and how do we measure that?
That's a very valid question. We've taken a note of it and we're at time. So we're going to close right now. This is just a note. This is session 0, which is, it's meant to be us figuring out who's interested in this, what do they want to talk about, to what extent can we collaborate, things like that. So we're going to go back to the Blackboard and see what we can integrate and do justice to in the scope of this community of practice, and send you more information on how you can be a part of this. I'll just end by saying that this is meant to be a community. So if the more participation happens, the better for everyone involved. So please write to us. Our emails are open. The email you received about participating in this session 0 also has our contact information. So get in touch and we'll be looking forward to hearing from you. Mitchell, David, any last notes before we close?
But it's been really great to see how active the community is. I think we were both, or all three of us were perhaps a bit uncertain about what the community reception would be. But from this first session, it feels like it's going to be really strong. I'm really excited to learn, to kind of keep moving forward.
I just want to thank everybody for carving time out. I think there's so much work that's going to be built on top of the kind of like the prevalence indicators, from trust and safety to impact. So getting this foundation right strikes me as quite important, and making sure the work's informed by what people are doing. So we're really keen to listen in here and create a space where people can come together and have this conversation, because I think we are potentially setting metrics that might be used for the coming decade or more to drive a whole bunch of change across multiple governments. So the responsibility to do this correctly and get it right feels very, very strong. So just really grateful for people carving out time. So thanks so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. I'll stop the recording.